For most of my childhood, my family had already decided what kind of person I was. The quiet daughter who would always stand in someone else's shadow, while my older brother, Ethan Caldwell, was destined to become the family success story. At every holiday, my parents praised his confidence, his business instincts, and his expensive education, while my achievements were treated like charming little hobbies that would never amount to anything. And when I earned a scholarship to study economics and statistics at a university in Pittsburgh, my father simply smiled and said, "That's nice, Claire, but eventually you'll need a practical career." I never argued with them, because somewhere along the way I realized that being underestimated gave me something far more valuable than approval. Freedom, and while Ethan spent his 20s building a chain of specialty equipment companies with money borrowed from our father's connections, I quietly built something of my own, learning how markets moved, how companies failed, how investors protected themselves, and most importantly, how powerful people could become careless when they believed nobody in the room was smarter than them. After graduation, I accepted what sounded like an ordinary position with a financial analytics contractor in Richmond, Virginia, where my relatives imagined I spent my days buried beneath spreadsheets and government paperwork. But behind a locked office door, I was developing forecasting systems that helped clients identify hidden risks before they became expensive disasters. Within 5 years, my work had earned me a partnership, several private investments, and eventually enough capital to launch my own private investment firm, North Star Capital. Yet I deliberately kept the company out of my family's conversations because I knew exactly what would happen if they discovered it. And I had no interest in watching Ethan turn my achievements into another competition he needed to win. By the time I was 31, North Star had quietly invested in technology, logistics, renewable manufacturing, and industrial automation companies across the country. But the most interesting opportunity landed on my desk when I discovered that Ethan's company, Caldwell Industrial Systems, was preparing for a massive expansion that could either make him extraordinarily wealthy or expose weaknesses he had been hiding for years. The company had excellent engineers, strong customers, and a promising product line, but its finances were dangerously stretched. So instead of confronting my brother directly, I created an investment structure through an independent fund and offered Caldwell Industrial a large emergency financing package with strict performance requirements, board protections, and a conversion clause that would give the investor substantial ownership if the company violated certain financial conditions. And Ethan signed immediately because, as usual, he believed nobody around him understood business better than he did. For nearly 18 months, I remained completely invisible while the money transformed his company, allowing him to open a new facility outside Columbus, purchase advanced machinery, renegotiate supplier contracts, and secure several lucrative contracts that pushed annual revenue from roughly $70 million to more than $280 million. At family gatherings, Ethan proudly described the turnaround as proof of his extraordinary leadership, sometimes even laughing when someone mentioned my career, saying, "Claire analyzes numbers for a living, but running a real company is completely different." While I sat quietly at the table knowing that the expansion he was bragging about existed largely because of capital I had supplied and financial decisions my representatives had helped implement behind the scenes. Everything changed during my parents' anniversary celebration at an elegant hotel in Washington, D.C., where Ethan had invited several executives and potential partners, and my mother pulled me aside before dinner to ask me not to make things awkward by discussing my work. She suggested I tell people I was still doing government analysis, because Ethan wanted the evening to focus on his achievements, and instead of becoming angry, I simply smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mom, I won't take anything away from him." Although privately I knew the evening was about to become very different because that afternoon I had received a report showing that Ethan had breached one of the financing agreement's most important requirements. During dinner, Ethan performed exactly as expected, describing his company's growth, his leadership philosophy, and the mysterious investment group that had supposedly recognized his brilliance early. until one of his guests asked an innocent question about the financing structure behind the expansion. Ethan confidently explained that he had negotiated an unusually sophisticated arrangement, and when another guest asked about the investor's identity, he laughed and said, "They're private people who prefer to stay out of the spotlight." But then he turned toward me and joked, "Claire wouldn't understand any of it anyway," which finally made me place my glass on the table and say, "Actually, I understand the agreement very well, including the covenant you violated last month." The conversation stopped instantly, and Ethan stared at me as though I had suddenly begun speaking another language. So I calmly explained that the financing required the company to maintain specific liquidity levels, obtain approval before certain acquisitions, and keep its debt exposure below an agreed threshold, while his latest acquisition had pushed the company beyond that limit. "How could you possibly know those numbers?" he demanded, and I answered, "Because I was the person who approved the financing," before placing a folder on the table containing the original agreement, the breach notice, and a letter from my attorneys stating that the conversion process could begin immediately. And when Ethan looked toward the executives for support, one of them quietly said, "Ethan, I think you should let her finish." Father's expression changed first, followed by my mother. Because the name on the documents was North Star Capital, the same investment firm that had provided the money everyone believed came from an anonymous institutional investor. Ethan stared at me and whispered, "That's you." And I replied, "Yes, it was always me," before explaining that I had never invested to destroy his company, but to give it a chance to succeed while protecting my capital. And the moment he realized that the sister he had spent years mocking had been the person financing his greatest success, his confidence disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable silence of someone finally seeing the consequences of his own arrogance. Ethan immediately begged for another chance, promising that he would correct the financial breach, apologize publicly, and give me anything I wanted if I would cancel the conversion. But I refused because the agreement had been clear from the beginning, and I reminded him that I had given him 18 months of support without taking credit, while he had spent those same 18 months telling everyone that I was incapable of understanding business. Within 72 hours, the conversion was completed, giving North Star controlling ownership of Caldwell Industrial Systems. And rather than shutting the company down, I removed Ethan from the chief executive position, installed an experienced operations director, rebuilt the financial department, and kept the engineers and employees who had made the business valuable in the first place. 1 year later, Caldwell Industrial Systems was healthier than it had ever been. Revenue had climbed significantly, debt had fallen, and the company had secured contracts Ethan had once considered impossible, while Ethan retained a minority stake that continued producing substantial income even though he no longer controlled the business. I eventually saw him at a family gathering, and for the first time in our lives, he did not introduce himself as the smartest person in the room. Instead, he looked at me and quietly said, "You really were building something all those years." And I answered, "I was, Ethan, you just never bothered to look." Because I finally understood that my victory was never about humiliating him or proving my family wrong. It was about refusing to shrink myself simply because other people were comfortable with a smaller version of me, and the greatest revenge was not taking his company, but becoming successful enough that I no longer needed anyone's permission to define my worth. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.